Well, welcome to the stage, Madam President, Mr. Vice President, and Assistant Secretary General. Thank you very much for your insights during your presentations and keynotes. And I'd like to start with the role of United Nations and activities of United Nations organizations. United Nations has definitely been very active throughout its history, just for peacekeeping, but also in many humanitarian programs and better governance programs, and has been supporting a lot of nations in healthcare, water and sanitation, fight with poverty, but now it's a digital time. So Fabrizio, maybe you can comment how you see how UN and UN organizations could support nations in their digital transformation, and also reflecting to the high-level panel outcomes what you briefed us, how you see how UN be more digital as an organization and supporting the digital global governance issues.
No, thank you very much, and let me say again what it is, what a privilege it is to be here in Estonia, which really is an example for the world, and with such a distinguished panel. I think what we're realizing that if there ever was a clear separation between the analog world and the digital world, that separation is breaking down. And we're in a new digital age where everything we do, all aspects of how we conduct business privately, in our communities, nationally and globally, is ever more infused by the digital prerogative. And that's not just a change in terms of switching from text to the digital domain. It has massive implications in systems and in how we interact. Social media has been a qualitative change in interaction. And we've seen how it's brought people together, but how it's also fueled conflict, undermined social cohesion. In Myanmar, for example, it led to increased inter-ethnic violence. We've seen how the digital sphere also impacts on human rights in ways that were not anticipated. And we've also seen how the digital can both do much to reduce inequality, much to promote sustainable development, and Estonia is a good example of that, but we've also seen how it can contribute to inequality. And the fact now that just 5 companies have annual turnovers that are equivalent to some industrial states is an indicator for that. Also, many countries are being left behind. So the UN, in trying to pursue its mandate of reducing the threats to international peace and security, to promoting sustainable development and to upholding human rights, has also to adapt to the digital world. And that can take many forms. One is just getting a better understanding. And we're doing everything possible with many member states in New York to try and increase understanding of an education in the new digital domain, in the way that's happening in classrooms in Estonia, but with senior diplomats and senior bureaucrats like me in New York. At another level, we're trying to gear ourselves up to helping member states build up their capacity. And I felt tremendously proud when the President mentioned the work of UNDP in helping Estonia becoming such a leader. But we would like to be able to do that in many more countries. And the recommendations of the high-level panel will include recommendations about how we can strengthen capacity of states who are lacking it at a regional level across the world. And then finally, I think we also need to get a better grasp of what the threats are in the cyber domain. I mean, the founders of the United Nations, the writers of international law, when they wrote about how to avoid international conflict and how to make sure that when it happened, civilians were safeguarded, did not anticipate the digital world. And we need to rethink what those international rules mean and how they should be applied to digital threats. So there's a lot for the UN to do, but we depend on it, our member states, and in particular those who've so successfully moved forward with these challenges, to help create the global leadership in recognition of the fact that in a digital world, we're all interdependent. So no country or region will be able to advance on its own and will always remain vulnerable if the rest of the world isn't also advancing.
Thank you. Madam President, you have been visiting a lot of countries during last years and also promoting Estonia as a candidate for the UN Security Council member. So do you think that small countries like Estonia is actually, with 1.3 million population, is 155th state by size globally. So we are almost non-existing, but we are still here. So is there a role for the small countries also to change the world, to fight with the problems what I mentioned in sustainable development goals like poverty, water, access to water, sanitation, access to education, access to healthcare? So how we can promote it, how we can support with our digital initiatives?
Well, I think we have demonstrated that if you smart and concentrate your work on not adding a drop into the ocean, let's say our meager resources for the development aid or even our resources to establish embassies globally, you know, we don't have many, but we have actually narrowly pinpointed where we want to spend our resources. And this has been trying to promote where we have been successful. And it's not only digital why we think it's very important to promote it. It's also because we have rebelled many times in our history against the wise advice of international organizations who have told us, do exactly like we say, do exactly like countries before you, and then you will catch up with us. We found it fundamentally wrong from the moment we did our monetary reform, because we've always realized that if you do everything like the others before you, then you are a weak copy and you cannot be better. So I think our message actually has been louder. But for a small state, you talked so nicely about our cooperation, and you know, UNDP, because of this cooperation with Estonia and trying to work with us also to establish the digital needs of different countries, has actually come to the conclusion that they now need to digitalize their own machinery as well. This is the first UN body who has realized itself that, I mean, digital provides a lot of economy and efficiency. And this, if this happens, will be a great achievement for all small countries, because big ones are not bothered by UN bureaucracy. Small ones are very much bothered by UN bureaucracy and very much hindered in their active participation, because there is, I mean, lots of data non-sortable and it comes out of your fax machines. So if by this cooperation UNDP becomes digitalized, I hope we will also provide impetus for other UN bodies to digitalize. And this will now have a global effect of making UN the place where, I mean, countries and regions can come and see how these things function and work, how digital systems make their lives easier. If this were to happen, it would be also a great benefit for this very important element, which I felt Vice President Ansip's speech was dedicated, creating the necessary legal space for technologies to thrive. Because when UN will itself be digital, it will also see the international legal space in this context automatically. I'm convinced of it, because here in Estonia, when we regulate for digital services, we differ from other countries because we are not regulating them, these private things out there. We are regulating for ourselves how our own services, for example, can cope with data security regulation which European Union has applied. It gives you a much better insight. So UN Digital will be much better, in much better position to work with digital regions globally. And I would also like to add that UN has a clear advantage in knowing all the legislative spaces which exist in digital, being able to pinpoint to the weaknesses, as you were doing, the risks, I mean, that there will be terrorist networks created, etc. All of these problems cannot be solved, or none actually can be solved by technology. It all comes down to the legal space surrounding technology. And you heard from Vice President how difficult it is to create this surrounding legal space. It's very easy to hire somebody to, I mean, give you a digital solution. It's much harder to get local, regional, and global legal environment to protect our people. And therefore, a digital UN will simply do a better work. Also, I know that European Union Commission is striving to work more digitally as well. Andrus, will we one day have a digital ID which will function globally?
Or across Europe, at least. Okay, thank you, Madam President. Now returning to our regional cooperation issues, and Mr. Ansip, you underlined that it takes like 4 or 5 years to switch on the European digital market. But what was the main obstacle? Was it like legal obstacle, or was it like companies against it, governments against it? What was the main bottleneck? What we can learn for other regions from this process you did during the last 5 years?
Well, there are many of those bottlenecks. Let's take this roam like at home, abolishing of roaming surcharges. It seems that it's easy. Just be brave and vote in favor, and it will be done. But it's not so easy.
There are companies.
Companies, different member states. We have 28 member states still in the European Union, and we know that in southern countries, for example, in Malta, Cyprus, Croatia, in some parts of Spain, mobile operators, they have to make quite remarkable investments to provide those mobile services to tourists visiting those beautiful countries only during the free summer month. And it means those companies, they are not able to get revenues during the other 9 months. And it sounds very natural to ask for high roaming surcharges in those countries. Well, at the same time, in Nordic countries, here in Estonia, in Finland, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Latvia, Lithuania, we have the most efficient and innovative mobile operators in Europe. And prices here in this region are quite affordable prices. A year ago, in Finland, it was possible to buy for the same amount of money 100 times more gigabytes than people were able to buy in Hungary. And of course, when price is pretty affordable, people would like to use those gigabytes. A year ago, average consumption per person in Finland was 13 gigabytes per month. In Hungary, 0.5, average for the whole European Union, but just 1 tiny gigabyte. So it's not so easy just to be brave and then vote in favor. You have to negotiate to find this right balance. Then, in many cases, it's really so that even if knowing that your existing business model is totally unsustainable, it's very difficult to switch on something new, because you never know what will happen in your company. Will you be able to enlarge your market share, or maybe you will lose your market share at all? So companies, they are not so keen to take some new risks, and especially those companies, but also some kind of unions, associations representing some people. They are quite conservative, and for them it's easier to say no for some kind of reforms. So you have to find right balance. There are different interests, different situations, and I don't want to say that some people, they are just bad people and some people are good people. Situations are different. Conditions are different, and we have to deal with all those people and different situations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now returning to the global issue of how digital can help to achieve sustainable development goals. And actually we once made an exercise in e-governance academy and trying to understand how digital can help against poverty, water and sanitation, saving the seas. And we find that almost in for every of those sustainable development goals, there is also a digital answer, how digital can support, maybe in some cases more, some cases less, but there was an answer in every case. But it's always the question how to start. Is it like identity for all, better payment ecosystems, what are globally available, better data protection, better roaming? So what do you think, where we need to start and how it should go forward, Madam President?
I think identity is the key of everything, because if there is too much anonymity, then many people find the various reasons of why internet cannot be trusted, and people have to rely on identity which is provided by private companies, but private companies cannot create this legal security for identities. So I think identity is the most important thing. Everything else we can thereafter resolve. But giving people digital identity would mean that we would have less people in the world who have no identity at all. We will know much better where our people are and how we can help them.
And how we do.
Yes, and also, of course, we would learn also to regulatively protect the privacy of our people and their human rights. None of this can be done without identity. So for me, identity is the starting point for everything. Digital and the climate change is a very important example. For example, I have participated in a climate conference organized by Marshall Islands, and I had to check which country it exactly was before, because I had no memory, because of course I didn't go there. We all did a video and sent it in. Because this thinking that we can do things from afar, I mean, makes that we are not taking so many flight hours and flight miles. The ability to do things from afar, and you mentioned my travels for the Security Council campaign. I couldn't have done this work as efficiently if we didn't have the possibility to digitally sign stuff. I would have had to cancel my state visit to Portugal to come back to Estonia to sign in Prime Minister, the candidate for the Prime Minister, who then could seek support from the Parliament if we didn't have digital ID. I mean, I didn't have to do all this. I did it from Portugal. And similarly, I was able to travel to Invictus Games and then visit the Pacific Islands, talk with Australia about our common project which we are undertaking in Pacific Islands for 3 weeks. Nothing stopped in this country for 3 weeks. So also, for example, when we were looking for a new chief of the higher court here in Estonia, because we are used to doing things from afar, people do not feel like it's disrespectful to talk to them over Skype from the different end of the world. And so in general, you would get much less CO2 emissions. If you say Estonians save 2% of the GDP by only signing digitally and 4 or 5 working days, and a paper tower as high as Eiffel Tower in a month, these are all environmental savings. And I really am seeking international cooperation to work for the next 2.5 years of my mandate as a president, very much on the climate change issues as well. Because as I said in my speech, if we cannot stop and reverse climate change, then all this we are dealing with here today is simple short-termism and totally useless.
So I understand that next conference will take place virtually, so you are not invited, but you just need to sit at home and look at the screen. Yeah, Fabrizio.
Thank you. I think we have to look very context-specific about the impact on development, because it's not natural. It needs to be steered, as Estonia steered it. I think left to its own devices, in some cases it can aggravate inequality. The whole impact of the digital technology and related artificial intelligence economies is going to have a massive impact on jobs. And every country needs to study independently what that impact will be. But in the US, I think there are 8 million truck drivers who face a very uncertain future with self-driving trucks. So that needs to be looked at country by country. And hopefully the UN will build up capacity to do that. Elsewhere, I think we need to think of the role of digital within the broader development environment. Before I came to New York, I was working in Central African Republic. In the Central African Republic, I think only 13% of the population have access to electricity. Well, if you only have 13% of the population with access to electricity, and the majority of the population illiterate, digital is a very big jump forward. You need to create the enabling environment until you do that. So this needs to be looked at regionally and country by country. I would say one of the first stages, though, is increased access. I mean, I think digital technology theoretically could now reach about 90% of the global population. And I had this discussion with the minister of Rwanda, who's here with us today, and Rwanda is another country like Estonia that has made big strides forward. But there's a difference between coverage and access, and coverage is much more limited because affordable access is not there. In Europe, big steps have been taken, as we heard, to create affordable access, but that's still not the case in many parts of the world. So I think ensuring affordable digital access for all is a fundamental right. I have to say, in the panel discussions, there was a lot of controversy around digital ID. I think where people come from countries with a large amount of trust in their governments, there is the room for digital ID. But elsewhere, there's a lot of mistrust, and many also make the point about the right to be forgotten. So I think the first prerequisite is digital coverage, and then one has to look country by country what the best model is.
Thank you. Vice President Ansip, a couple of minutes left.
Time is running out. Okay. I believe in progress, and progress, according to my understanding, always created more jobs than progress used to destroy. And why it has to be somehow differently this time. So we have to provide access to digital content to our people. And to provide access to digital content to our people, at first connectivity is needed. There are different practices. In Europe, we were global leaders during those 2G times. But with the 3G, 4G, governments started to ask for maximum amount of money when selling those frequencies. And then we had to say, sorry, Europe is lagging behind. With the 4G, behavior of governments in Europe was different. Some governments, they continued to ask for maximum amount of money. Operators had to pay those huge amounts. And of course, they didn't have enough money for investments. And there was even no need to make those investments because market was blocked already. The aim of other countries, also for Estonia, was to cover the country as soon as possible with the new generation networks. And I'm absolutely sure those countries where this aim was to cover the country as soon as possible with new generation networks didn't lose in revenues, because economies in those countries were able to grow faster, because new generation of networks was available in those countries. The same situation we can see also in African countries. You mentioned Rwanda, rapidly developing in digital meaning. But there are some other countries. Just recently I visited one of them. Government is still asking for maximum amount of money when selling frequencies, talking about spectrum allocation auctions. And it's not enough. They are setting special tax on telecom operators. And even this is not enough. They are setting a tax to access to social media networks. Well, we are all dreaming about having digital industries in our countries. And even traditional industries, they are digital already. And access to social networks, it's also somehow about skills. Digital public services, it's not only about efficiency, transparency, and inclusiveness, it's also about skills. And if people will not have access to social media networks, government is not providing those digital services, which are really user-friendly services to people, from where those governments are expecting to get those highly skilled workers. It's impossible. So I'm not ready to say that digital ID is basis for everything, but in Estonia it was so, but we had to create also a unified data exchange platform, and even this wasn't enough. Then we implemented once-only principle on the level of the government, and it gave real boost on usage of digital identities for Estonians. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very interesting discussion. Unfortunately, our time is over. Thank you, Madam President, Mr. Vice President Ansip, and Deputy Secretary General Hochschild for this great discussion. Now, Madam President leaves with ministers. All the rest of guest visitors, please remain seated. Thank you very much. Give a warm applause.